Terry Barber is a best-selling author and founder of Lighthouse Catholic Media. Jesse Romero is a retired law enforcement officer, a former kickboxing champion with a master's degree in theology. And together, they share a passion for evangelization and PhDs in common sense. You're listening to The Terry and Jesse Show on Immaculate Heart Radio. To join the show, call 888-526-2151. Here's Terry and Jesse.
Welcome to the Terry and Jesse Show. Jesse's out. He'll be back tomorrow. I have some special guests with me, but let me ask you a question. Have you heard about the Charlie Gard case? Have you? It's about a terminally ill infant who's come to the attention of two of the most powerful people on the planet, Pope Francis and U.S. President Donald Trump. Here's what happened. Last week, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that the hospital can continue life support to the baby who has a rare genetic disease. His doctors wish to take him off the life support, but the parents disagree. Charlie's parents, they want the hospital to release their son to them in their custody so that they can take him to the United States for an experimental treatment. Now, on Sunday, as I said, Pope Francis called for the parents of the baby who are in the hospital in London to be allowed to accompany and treat their child till the end. How would you feel if it was your son or daughter in the hospital, your mom, your dad? Would you be upset with the state saying, wait a minute, he's my son. The state doesn't own him. I have a right as a parent. Would you think that? All right, that's one question. Next question. Do you have devotion to St. Maria Goretti? This is the feast day for her. She was an 11-year-old girl, but wait, I have better than that. She was an Italian saint, so I brought my Italian doctor in, Dr. Ed Mazza. Dr. Mazza, welcome to the Terry and Jesse Show again.
Buongiorno a tutti.
There you go. Dr. Ed, you're a professor of history at Azusa Pacific College, but you're an Italian, obviously. You just spoke in Italian to me. And then we're talking about her feast day, St. Maria Goretti, and I want you to share with our listeners the story behind her life because I think it's very appropriate for our culture today.
Most definitely. She's a model and patron for purity for our young people, because even though she wasn't quite 12 years old yet, she was the daughter of some Italian peasants. And one day when she was alone, this 18-year-old boy, Alessandro, wanted her to consent to illicit sexual relations.
Yep.
And the amazing thing is not so much that she resisted, which any innocent girl would not want to consent to, but she said, "No, God does not wish it. It is a sin. You would go to hell for it."
Wow.
So can you imagine? This is someone
amazing.
who has compassion. Jesus said, "Love your enemies."
Yeah.
I mean, and then he struck her 14 times with a blade, and she died 24 hours later after receiving her last Holy Communion before she died. And he went to prison for. He was in prison for almost 30 years. Mm-hmm. But while he was in prison, he got a special visitor.
I love this.
Maria Goretti.
Yes.
She appeared to him. Yeah, this guy was a piece of work, Alessandro. He used to look at pornography.
That's a good point. He did.
He was unrepentant, but after he had this miraculous, this miraculous encounter with Maria,
yes,
he became a changed man. He went, when he got out of prison, he went to Maria's mother and asked forgiveness.
And that was Christmas Eve, and he brought something to Maria's mother. What was it that he brought? It was so significant.
Well, I believe it was the lily. The lily is a symbol of purity.
That's right.
And he brought her 14 lilies to make up for the 14 stab wounds that he inflicted on Maria.
Contrition.
And then in 1947, Maria was beatified by Pope Pius XII.
Oh my
and
gosh.
3 years later, she was canonized in 1950. And 66-year-old Alessandro was among the 250,000 people who was at the ceremony when she became a saint.
Amazing. Dr. Ed, that's an amazing story, but I also want to talk to you about the history of the Mass. But before I do that, because you're a historian, What other dates today? I know that there's a Thomas More saint who he died on this date, if I'm understanding it correctly. And for the benefit of all of our listeners, can you tell us the significance of this date in history?
Yes. July 6th is when St. Thomas More was executed. St. Thomas More is a great Catholic layman, a great Catholic saint who refused to compromise on when Henry VIII, the King of England, wanted to make himself the head of the Church of England instead of the Pope.
Right.
And also when he wanted to give himself his own annulment or divorce so he could marry this 20 years younger courtier, woman at court, Anne Boleyn, and accept her as legitimate queen. And Thomas More couldn't go along with all this, and so he was one of the few people one of the few Catholics who was willing to stand up for the truth of marriage and the truth of the office of Peter in the church. And he was put to death on this date. But he was a brilliant man. He was a Renaissance man, and he had a sense of humor too. When the minister helped him up the gallows, he thanked him, but he said, "I won't be needing any help getting down." And his head was chopped off because he was a nobleman. And if he hadn't been a nobleman, he would have been hung, drawn, and quartered.
Wow.
And this is a family program, so I won't get into the details of what that would have involved.
Yeah, I got it. Didn't he have a great comment about being a servant for God first? What was this comment? Because I think our listeners, every one of us, would like to hear what he had to say on that.
Yeah, it's very famous. He said, I die the king's good servant, but God first.
Oh, man.
And that's actually the motto at Azusa Pacific University, is God first.
That's awesome.
And that's he exemplified that, and Maria Goretti exemplified that. They loved their enemies, but they were not willing to compromise their purity or their integrity to go along with error and falsehood and sin.
Yeah. Dr. Ed, there's another woman that St. John Paul II beatified. It's very similar to Maria Goretti. Her name is Perina Morcinini. She was beatified exactly 40 years after Maria's beatification. And she was declared the patroness of rape victims. And she was only 26 years old when a very similar situation happened. And I got to tell you, Dr. Ed, you're a college professor. I look at the statistics of how these young women are at college and how many of them have been sexually abused and attacked. It's a terrible percentage. And so I think we have to look at the saints, our older brothers and sisters, to be able to have the grace to say no to these things because it's so prevalent. Dr. Ed, I also want to mention to our listeners, you get a series called the First 500 Years of History of the Catholic Church, which is fascinating if you like history, and that's available here if you call the 877-526-2151. It's a 4-CD set. And also the Dark Ages, you're an expert on that also. And I want people to understand, and when you know history, it really does give things a perspective when you're living today, because you can see things for the whole picture. So if you want any of that material of Dr. Ed Mazza's The Dark Ages, Church History Volume 2, or Church History, the First 500 Years, call the 877-526-2151. Now, I want to shift gears, and before I do that, we're going to be taking a break. I forgot to mention this to everyone. Here at the Catholic Resource Center, we work and we do this radio ministry right out of the Sacred Heart Chapel in Covina. And by the way, if you know of some other apostolate that's looking for office space, we have 2 offices available as of yesterday. And if you, whether you're a real estate man or counseling, you want counseling, we have private offices, and it's a great environment because we have the Sacred Heart Chapel right next to our offices. If you want to rent with us, you just call me, Terry Barber, 877-526-2151. I'd be delighted to help you get in, and we'd love to have another kindred spirit tenant to help us with our ministry. Also, if you go to our website, catholicrc.org, you'll notice Pro-Life Realtor. This is a ministry that helps us out, and it helps you because you get an on-fire real estate person to help you in selling your house. And the commission, also, they give a portion back to us at the Catholic Resource Center. Go to catholicrc.org, and you can find out about your pro-life realtor. And also, I just want to mention, if you want Dr. Ed Mazza to come to your parish to speak on history or any of the topics he does, just call us at 877-526-2151. I will personally pass that on to Dr. Mazza. Also, just a quick note, this Saturday I'm going to be at St. Louis de Marillac in Covina speaking on theology of the tap, and I'm going to be talking about Our Lady of Fatima. And if you'd like me to come to your parish, all you got to do is call that toll-free number, 877-526-2151. I'm going to encourage also, when we talk after the break, we're going to talk about the Mass, the history of the Mass. My favorite set by Dr. Scott Hahn is How to Get the Most Out of the Mass, Discover Heaven on Earth in the Holy Mass. And what I love about Dr. Hahn is he takes you step by step to the Mass by blessing yourself and realizing you're committing yourself to your baptismal promises, and all the way through the Mass. You can get that set by calling 877-526-2151 or go online to catholicrc.org. When we come back, I'm going to ask Dr. Mazza the question about the history of the Mass. Because you know what I've found after 40 years of ministry? Most Catholics have no clue on what's going on at the Mass. They go because it's an obligation, which is sad. I'm just telling it like it is. Think about it, everybody. Think about it individually. How many people are not even going to Mass? 75% of us as Catholics. I want you to come back after the break because you're going to learn a lot about the history of the Mass and what the Mass is, so that when you go to Sunday Mass, you'll get even more out of it, because it would be like going to a baseball game and not understanding the game of baseball. It's kind of boring. Well, let's delve into that after this break on how to get the most out of the Mass. If you want to get the CD set by Scott Hahn, call 877-526-2151. We'll be right back after a quick break.
Back to the Terry and Jesse Show on Immaculate Heart Radio. Want to join the conversation? Call 888-526-2151. Now here's Terry and Jesse.
Welcome back to the Terry and Jesse Show. Jesse's out of town. I have my good friend Dr. Ed Mazza, professor of history at Azusa Pacific College in Azusa, California. And we're talking about the Mass right now. We're saying, have you ever thought about the history of the Mass? I mean, I've been going to Mass since I was 13 years old, daily Mass, because I found out something that I'm hoping I'm going to share with you, that we're present at that one eternal sacrifice every time we go to Mass, and that it's the greatest act of worship we can do. And that touched me so much that here I am, 60 years old, still going to daily Mass and still fired up about Jesus, because the Vatican Council says that the Mass is the source and summit of the Christian life. It's the Eucharist. And I'm giving away a CD called How to Get the Most Out of the Mass, Discovering Heaven on Earth by Dr. Scott Hahn. You might want to get the entire set discounted by calling 877-526-2151. Dr. Mazza, today's date, again, you're a history buff. We have some significant dates here regarding the Mass. What happened 10 years ago that's so significant in the life of the Church?
Yes, well, tomorrow is July 7th, and so 10 years ago, it was 07/07/07. And on that lucky 7 day, Pope Benedict XVI.
Yes, what did he do?
He issued a document, which basically is called Summorum Pontificorum, and it empowered every single Catholic priest with the right to offer the traditional rite of the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, which is commonly known as the Latin Mass, and technically nowadays is called the extraordinary form of the Mass.
Right.
This was a Mass that was in effect, for over a thousand years and more, until 1969, 1970. Anyway, so and also prior to that, Pope St. John Paul the Great, on July 2nd, 1988. Had issued a document called Ecclesia Dei, in which he had granted permission for the Mass to be said, but Pope Benedict made it possible for a more generous offering, even than when Pope St. John Paul had offered.
Very good. And so just for the benefit of all of us who are listening individually here, what's the difference between what we call the extraordinary form and the ordinary form? In other words, is it language? Is it the format? Educate each one of us on the difference between the ordinary form and the extraordinary form.
Well, I'll tell you what. Let's start with the extraordinary form, because it is extraordinary in more ways than one. Well, first of all, I'd like to actually get back to what you said about the Mass itself. You know, as a historian, I can't think of a more important event in the history of mankind than the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus.
Amen.
Right?
Amen. Of course, there's nothing more powerful.
And imagine, you know, if we could actually go back in a time machine and be present at the foot of the cross. I mean, what Catholic, what Christian wouldn't want to do that? Or even, you know, just some curiosity seeker who's not even a believer would want to be there, right, and see for himself.
Right.
Well, we have the opportunity to do that whenever Holy Mass is offered. Is this microphone on?
Yeah, say that again, man. That's powerful. What? We're present at that one eternal sacrifice? Sign me up!
There is no difference between what Jesus did on the cross 2,000 years ago and what you and I experience when we go to Mass.
Unbelievable. Whenever
Mass is offered, except for the fact that one was bloody and what the other is unbloody.
Yeah, that's...
So, and this has been the case, you know, this is the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, and our separated brethren, our Protestant brothers and sisters, they don't view the worship of God the way that we do. And so let's put this all together here. You see, if you want to understand an event, you got to go back and look at the historical the earliest historical documents, right?
Sure, that makes
sense.
So,
thankfully, we've got the letters of Paul. We've got the biblical documents that speak about the Mass. So we have the Gospels, and then we have letters of Paul, especially Paul's letter to the Corinthians. But in addition to that, folks may not know this, but we have historical records of the earliest Christians. For example, we have a document called the Didache. It was written in Greek. It might have been written at the time of the apostles themselves were alive. And it says, regarding what we call today Mass, assemble on the Lord's Day and break bread and offer the Eucharist.
Amazing.
But first, make confession of your faults so that your sacrifice may be a pure one.
Right. That's powerful.
So what sacrifice are we talking about here? Because Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice, right? So there's not, you know, we don't sacrifice sheep and bulls and that kind of thing anymore, right? So it's talking about the one sacrifice that Jesus offered on the cross once for all, but is represented to us during the Eucharist. You see?
That's powerful.
And then as we go through again some of these early writings, for example, there is a early church father, Clement of Rome, who wrote his own letter to the Corinthians, just like Paul did. And Clement, in his letter to the Corinthians, says, "Our sin will not be small if we were to kick out from the bishops those who have blamelessly and holily offered its sacrifices." So we could go through, you know, document after document from the early church and see that the essence of the Mass is that it's the sacrifice that Jesus is offering to the Father.
Yeah. Dr. Ed, I had to interrupt you because I'm thinking, if I was listening and I'm going, wow, I did not know that. And if this is the first time you're hearing this about the Mass, you've been going to Mass for most of your life, right? I'm going to encourage you to get Dr. Scott Hahn, How to Get the Most Out of the Mass series, because he walks you through each step of the Mass. And you can get that by calling 877-526-2151. Dr. Mazza, before we go, we only have a couple minutes, like 4.5 minutes. Can you tell our listeners why it would be important for individuals to understand what takes place at the Mass, and how can they get a better understanding through history what the Mass is?
Well, you have to understand, let's take St. Maria Goretti or St. Thomas More.
Sure.
These are saints that were nourished on the extraordinary form of the Mass in particular, and on the Mass in general, you see. And it's when we receive Holy Eucharist worthily in a state of grace, we get an increase of sanctifying grace.
That's the life of God in us. Go ahead.
Exactly. God's own life within us. I mean, it's unimaginable, you see. And also, you know, St. Ignatius of Antioch, for example, he says that the Eucharist is the medicine of immortality And it's the way that we escape death and live in Jesus forevermore.
Hey, time out. Time out. Is this microphone on? Are you kidding me? Dr. Ed, the Bible in John 6, unless you eat of my body and drink of my blood, you have no life in you, for my flesh is real food. What did this say? Repeat that again for us, because when I don't know if we realize every Sunday we go to receive Holy Communion, that's what we're receiving. Repeat that statement, because it's powerful.
St. Ignatius of Antioch, who was a martyr, he died around the year 100. He was the bishop of Antioch, where the Christians were first called Christians.
Yes.
He was killed in Rome. He was fed to the lions.
Wow.
And but he was a great bishop. And he said that the Eucharist is the medicine of immortality and the sovereign remedy by which we escape death and live in Jesus. So he was giving an exegesis on John 6.
Absolutely.
What John 6 means. And so what Catholics can take away from that in their liturgy today is it's so important. There's nothing more important you can do for God. There's no more powerful prayer you can offer to God than to assist at the holy sacrifice of the Mass, because you're actually cooperating in partnership with no less a person than Jesus Christ himself.
Wow. Dr. Ed, that statement says it all, and that's why I want people to call us at 877-526-2151 to get How to Get the Most Out of the Mass by Dr. Hahn. Before I let you go, I want to ask you, because our listeners are interested in the church history, the first 500 years. What do you cover? Because my understanding, I'm just going to ask you in a quick way, but that the church was persecuted for the first 300 years. And so do you cover how Christianity was spread in those first 500 years?
Yes. Unlike other world religions, like Buddhism or Islam or something, the Christianity was spread by the fact that the Romans put them to death.
Yes.
And the church father Tertullian said that it's the blood of the martyrs that was the seed of the church. And people, and even some of their persecutors were converted when they saw the good example.
Yep.
Even take the example of these young maidens that were killed, St. Lucy, St. Agatha, St. Agnes, or just like little Maria Goretti, And they were willing to, they were not willing to compromise on truth and worship. And if I could just tie this into the Mass.
Please do.
When John Paul the Great issued his document Ecclesia Dei almost 30 years ago, he said on July 2nd, he said, everyone should renew their conviction of the necessity of strengthening their fidelity to the Eucharist by rejecting erroneous interpretations and arbitrary and unauthorized applications of doctrine, liturgy, and discipline.
Wow.
So we have to be willing to really go all out to protect doctrine, liturgy, and the way the church does things to protect what's holy.
Wow. Dr. Ed, hold on. I've got Matt Arnold coming on, but I want to see if you can join us for this. Just, folks, if you want to get that church history, the first 500 years from Dr. Mazza, and I believe it, we have to do this. It's kind of like history repeating itself. If you want to get that series of 4 CDs, call 877-526-2151. You can get the church history by Dr. Ed Mazza. He's an expert on history of the church. He's also got another volume called The Dark Ages. That's available too. He's also done The Fire and Sword with Matthew Arnold. I mean, it's an amazing things that he's done on DVD. Call us at 877-526-2151. When we come back, we got Matt Arnold and Dr. Mazza talking about his book. We'll be right back.
This is Bishop David O'Connell, and you're listening to the Terry and Jesse Show on Immaculate Heart Radio.
Back to the Terry and Jesse Show on Immaculate Heart Radio. Want to join the conversation? Call 888-526-2151. Now here's Terry and Jesse.
Welcome back. Jesse's out of town, but I have my good friend Matt Arnold now joining me here at the Terry and Jesse Show. He is the author of a CD set called Fire and Sword on the Crusades, the Inquisition, Reformation, and it's a beautiful series. You can get that through us by calling the 877-526-2151 number. But Matthew's also a convert to the Catholic faith, and I want to set the stage. I want our listeners to understand where he's coming from, because in the fall there's a new book Ignatius Press is coming out called Confessions of a Traditional Catholic. So I want to take this time to welcome Matthew Arnold. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Terry.
Well,
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you here. You've always filled in with the Terry and Jesse show over the years. I've worked with you for 20 years now, and I think you're a real blessing to the Catholic Church. And I'm delighted to hear about your new book. But for those who haven't heard anything about you, can you kind of summarize a little bit about your walk into the Catholic Church, please?
Oh, sure thing, Terry. It really started back in the 90s. I got married in the church, although I did not convert at that time. Mm-hmm. I was not really interested in becoming Catholic. Although the priest who helped us through the process did make me promise to take the RCIA course whenever the kids came along, started having questions, right?
Sure.
Because you have to promise to raise your children in the faith.
Of course.
So when our first son was, not quite 3 years old, he had a question about the Eucharist. He asked his mom, how come everybody goes to communion except for me and Daddy? And she said, go ask your father.
I love that.
So obviously she wanted me to understand that he really had a question. So I agreed to take the RCIA. And it was actually during RCIA, we started praying the Rosary and asking for the intercession of the Blessed Virgin with the Holy Spirit, that he would enlighten our hearts and minds and so forth. And I had a very dramatic kind of conversion experience, came to the church, 1996 at the Easter Vigil there, and by 1998, I was working for you at St. Joseph Communications.
Amazing.
Doing a radio program with Scott Hahn and
amazing.
Being a creative director for all the tapes and stuff that we were producing at that time. So kind of jumped in with both feet.
I guess so. And now, Matthew, you also had part of your conversion because of your book titled Confessions of a Traditional Catholic. You were very traditional.
Right.
I mean, I knew that when I met you. It's one of the things I liked about you. But can you share with our listeners, first of all, your own walk into the church, but you did that, but also how you had questions that came up that I think a lot of our listeners would also have regarding traditional Catholicism.
Sure. Well, first off, let me say my foray into the traditionalist movement had nothing to do with any animus towards Vatican II or the new Mass or any of that stuff. Mm-hmm. I didn't have any problem reconciling the doctrines of the Church with the new liturgy. I didn't then. I don't now.
Right.
But what I was having issues with was just, the kind of the amount of liturgical abuse that the liturgy was suffering from.
Yeah.
So I had no nostalgia for the old church because I'd never been Catholic before 1996. I mean, I provided the guitar music for Mass myself.
I love it.
A lot of times.
Got it.
So, but then I went to a traditional Mass on the advice of an acquaintance, and I just fell in love with it.
And what was it
was just very clear?
What was it that got your attention in the what we call the extraordinary form?
Right. What it was really primarily, there was a diocesan church here in Orange County where I reside, where they were celebrating the Mass in the extraordinary form before it was even called that. It was under the Ecclesia Dei indult that Dr. Mazza talked about in the last half hour.
Sure.
But I guess it was the reverence, really, Terry. Mm-hmm. It was the obvious, the observable fact that something really special was going on. The many genuflections of the priest, the priest and the people all facing towards the altar, the kneeling, the music itself was very reverent, and the whole thing was kind of very subdued. Mm-hmm. And it was very clear. Even if you had no idea what was going on, you would know that it wasn't about you.
Well
Absolutely.
Said. Yeah.
And I think that was the thing that really attracted me to begin with.
So tell us then, you started going to a more traditional Mass, and what else? What other issues came up? Because you've written a book called Confessions of a Traditional Catholic. A little later, I'm going to ask you, what are those confessions? In other words, were you at a point where you said, I think maybe I need to leave the church? Did that ever come across to you?
Well, what happened is that, of course, I got more and more involved. I started reading more, and it was like I had found a pearl of great price, like it says in the Scriptures. Sure. And some part of me felt like I'd been robbed of my patrimony, because so much that's kind of implicit in today's liturgy and in catechetical formation is very explicit prior to the council. And so I was just discovering a lot of things. And when I came into the church, you said I was of a traditional bent. Well, I read Faith of Our Fathers by James Cardinal Gibbons. I listened to Fulton Sheen. I read Catholic Church Has the Answer by Paul Whitcomb. You know,
I did too.
And right. So that was I was kind of looking at that. I came to the church. I'm like, where's that Catholicism? Where are people doing that? Right. And it was the people going to the extraordinary form. Now, the crisis came when the priest who was celebrating the Mass retired, and they didn't, replace him with somebody else who could do it. Mm. And I had become very attached to it at that point, and it became a matter of now, to whom shall we go, right?
Sure.
And it became a matter of finding a place where I could go to this Mass. And I actually wound up at what they call an independent chapel.
I see.
So a priest he's a validly ordained priest who, was ordained in a institute that was set up under Ecclesia Dei to do the old sacraments, but he didn't have an assignment, so he wasn't technically under the local bishop, right? Mm-hmm. So it was a valid Mass, but it was not licit.
Right, that's a good distinction. Mm-hmm.
And licety, that's a pretty important thing, mm-hmm. And obviously the priests like that, they don't have faculties to hear confessions or to do marriages and so forth. So, it was. I justified it to myself by saying, look, do I want to go to a valid but illicit Mass that's very reverent and, wonderful and free of nonsense, or do I want to go back to a Mass that's, valid and in union with the local bishop, but probably illicit because of all of the nonsense all of the abuse and so forth. Sure. And so not really a good position to be in, but that was the justification that I used. And of course, you read all about it in the book.
Well, that's what I was.
Naturally,
Yeah. I assume
when
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say when Pope Benedict came out with the motu proprio,
yes.
Summorum Pontificum, then the Mass became more available. And I can tell you, my family, we left a skid mark on our way back into the embrace of the, diocesan auspices.
Folks, you're listening to the Terry and Jesse Show. Matthew Arnold's making me smile. He usually does that. But if you want to hear his conversion story completely, about an hour conversion story, I'm going to give a couple copies of it away if you call 877-526-2151. He and Dr. Mazza love history, and Matthew Arnold did Fire and Sword. He did the history on the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the Reformation. It's a very good series of 3 CDs. He talks about what the real motive was behind the Crusades. Why did the Inquisitors kill millions of innocent people? Okay, why did the Reformation happen? He goes on and on. It's very good and anybody can understand it. It's real simple. That's what I like about Matthew. He speaks very clearly. You can get that by calling the 877-526-2151. Matthew Arnold is my guest. He's written a book that's coming out this fall from Ignatius Press called The Confessions of a Traditional Catholic. When I come back after the break, I want to ask Matthew, wait a minute, what are those confessions? And I'm going to ask him this question because we have friends, you and I have friends that are not in the church right now. Maybe how do we bring them back? And I think Matthew's going to answer that question because of his bent in the sense of what he's been through as a convert to the Catholic faith. He has a different perspective than a cradle Catholic like me. I want to remind you, if you didn't hear the news, here at the Catholic Resource Center, we have 2 offices available. Yes, I say it right on the radio. If you're a Catholic and want to have a counseling office here at the Sacred Heart Chapel, our facilities, call me. I'd love to have you come in because we've got 2 offices available as of yesterday. Call us at 877-526-2151. Also, if you want Matthew Arnold to come to speak to you, I've had him here on Our Lady of Good Success here at the chapel, but if you want to go to Matthew Arnold, is it MatthewArnold.com, Matt, to get people to contact you?
It's .org.
Oh, excuse me.
.org.
MatthewArnold.org. So if you want to get a hold of Matthew Arnold, go to MatthewArnold.org, and he could come and speak not just on his book called The Confessions of a Traditional Catholic, but especially on Our Lady of Good Success. It's a very good presentation, and I would encourage you to do that. Go to MatthewArnold.org to get that. Also, if you want Dr. Mazza, Jesse Romero, and Matt Arnold on a series called Fire and Sword, The Crusades, a video, it's a DVD actually. Wow, this would be good to show to your kids, to anyone who's interested in that history period. And I'm giving it away. You just have to pay the shipping if you call 877-526-2151. And by the way, if you'd like me to come and speak on evangelization, how to share your faith with anyone. That's what I do. I'm going to be at St. Louis de Marillac this Saturday talking to the young people of Theology on Tap to talk about Our Lady of Fatima and evangelization. If you want me to come to your parish, just call me at 877-526-2151. Jesse Romero will be back tomorrow with me. You're listening to the Terry and Jesse Show. I have my good friend Matt Arnold, the author of an upcoming book called Confessions of a Traditional Catholic, published by our good friends at Ignatius Press. And you can get that by going to Ignatius in the fall season to pick that book up. I would highly recommend it. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I'm going to ask Matthew, what are some of these confessions, and how do we bring people back to the church who might have left to join another church? And you're listening to the Terry and Jesse Show. If you have a question or a comment, yes, our call-in number is 888-526-2151. If you want to pick up the CDs that we're giving out with Dr. Mazza and also Matthew Arnold, that number is 877-526-2151, or go online to catholicrc.org. That's catholicrc.org. We'll be right back with Matt Arnold.
This is Dr. Scott Hahn, and you are listening to the Terry and Jesse Show on Immaculate Heart Radio.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hahn. Matter of fact, Dr. Hahn wrote the introduction for Matthew Arnold's book, Confessions of a Traditional Catholic. Hey, he wrote my introduction for how to share your faith with anyone. Man, isn't that interesting? Matt Arnold, God love you. Hey,
close circle here.
Yeah, it certainly is. Matthew, I know Dr. Hahn had a lot of influence on you and also me. I just want to ask the question about your Confessions of a Traditional Catholic, the book. What can it do to help? What can we do to help bring back our fellow Catholics to the church, whether they've left because of, let's say scandal? We have that here at Immaculate Heart Radio. The number one prayer request is to help bring my son or daughter back to the church. So can you kind of shed a little light on what your book can do for that?
Well, sure. Well, first thing, too, you have to remember that when you say someone's a traditional Catholic, it's certainly possible to be a traditional Catholic and be in absolutely full communion with the church.
Absolutely, that's true.
We go to a diocesan church that offers the extraordinary form. I teach RCIA at that same church.
Good for you. You bet.
So I mean, you can be a traditional Catholic and be totally, like I say, in full communion.
Amen.
There are those who who step outside, who go to the maybe the Society of St. Pius X, right, which is a traditionalist society that kind of operates outside of the official diocesan authority, or you have the independent chapels, right, where it's just some priest who's kind of set up shop, or some little community that's got somebody say mass for them. And Ronald Reagan was a lifelong Democrat, and then he became a Republican later in his political life.
That's true.
And people asked him, Ronald, why did you leave the Democratic Party? He says, I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me.
That's right.
And that's the way I think a lot of these people feel. They feel like the Catholic Church has abandoned them somehow, in some way.
Yeah.
Something that gets underemphasized or gets ignored becomes the most important thing to them.
I could see
and then
that.
they wind up, gravitating. So a lot of these people, too, they start out with good intentions. I'm going to go to this Mass over here because my Mass is, there's a lot of liturgical abuse, or there's, some other issues, so I'm going to go over here. And I even had, when I first was, thinking about attending this traditional independent chapel, I went to a priest at my diocese, or at my parish, and said, I'm thinking about doing this, talk me out of it. And he said, well, you have to go where you're going to find the peace of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah. So he basically said, if you want to go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Which is probably not the tack that I would take.
Right.
Right. But the thing is, a lot of people, they go for some noble purpose. They're looking for a more reverent liturgy. They're looking for whatever their, a better experience at Mass. But the longer you stay outside of, the official authority of the Church, the more it becomes like a badge of identity.
Yeah.
Right. And and then pride gets into it, and you wind up maybe accepting a lot of things that you probably wouldn't have. Right. It's the old slippery slope. So I think the first thing is to say, look, the Church does have these things available, and if you can take advantage of them, you should, because it is important to be, I'll give the example when I spoke to our pastor, I'll put that in quotes, at the traditional independent chapel. Bishop Raffon had been up from Campos, Brazil, and they'd set up a personal prelature for the traditionalist Catholics down there so they could be in union with the church.
Good.
And I said, wouldn't it be great if they could do something like that here? And of course, this is back before Summorum Pontificum. And he said, why would I want to be under a bishop?
Wow.
So you can see that he had fallen right down that slippery slope.
Of course.
But the thing to remember, these people are not our enemies. They are Catholics. They are in union with the church imperfectly, but they need to give them that respect, even if it's some of these people can be pretty strident.
Got it.
So it's well to try and keep it on the objective.
So if you have a brother or sister who's gone to Pope Pius X, the church there, and they're upset with what's happening, how do we reach them and pull them back? I mean, I know I have a old saying that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. But how do you reach out to people who are just dead set on leaving the church because they think the scandals in the church or liturgical abuses? Because I run into people like that often. What else can you tell them?
Well, first off, buy my book.
Yeah, there you go.
because obviously we can go into much greater detail than I can.
Of course.
But but really the gist of it, like you say, people have to know that you care. So, if you're doing this on a personal level, you want to try and steer clear of the arguments and have a thick skin about people maybe having a less than civil approach to the current diocesan authority, wherever you might be, that sort of thing.
Gotcha.
And that's another thing that I bring up is that the Bible warns us about having a critical spirit, and the sins of the tongue. And the more you set yourself in opposition to, the legitimate authority of the church, the deeper that rift becomes and the less respectful you become and so forth. And that's kind of my argument is like, when was it, how is that traditional?
Yeah.
How is it traditional to be in a constant state of criticism of the authority of the church?
Yeah.
How is it traditional? When was it ever the tradition of the church for a priest or an independent bishop or whatever to set up his own apostolate over and against the legitimate authority territorially?
Yeah.
Right? These are not traditional answers to these issues, which the church has dealt with many times over the years.
Matthew, that's a great question to ask, and I'm sure you've got lots more in your book called Confessions of a Traditional Catholic. Ignatius Press is the publisher. It's scheduled to be released this fall. Check it out at ignatiuspress.com, and you can get that book there. I would encourage you to get it. Matthew, with just a few minutes left, I want to give a plug for some work you've done because I've seen such fruit from it over the years. 20 years ago, this Fire and Sword 3 CD set, I love it because it teaches us the basics on those issues of with the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the Reformation. And with the 500th anniversary coming up, it seems to me that we should all have a series, have that set by calling the 877-526-2151 number. But tell us why you did this, because I think I remember at the time you and I were chatting, but I want our listeners to know, why did you put this set out back then?
Well, it's first off, it's awfully ambitious to take on the three big historical shibboleths of the church all in one set.
Yes. Yeah, that's true.
The Inquisition and the Reformation, right?
Right.
But so many of the kind of negative materials about that managed to do it in an hour. Mm-hmm. And I thought, what I wanted to do was approach that history kind of the way Scott Hahn had approached answering common objections. Right? There's all of these kind of biblical objections that people have against the church. Well, just sort of break it down, take them one by one, and give the actual explanation or maybe correct misconceptions and so forth. And that's what I did. I just went to the historic, what's the word I'm looking for? The historians of today are doing a lot of research, especially after the Jubilee year 2000. St. John Paul II opened up the Vatican Secret Archives. So there's a whole lot of primary sources that are now available to legitimate scholars. And they're finding that a lot of the old myths about the church are exactly that. And they were put together by people that that
they had an agenda.
had a bone to pick with the church.
Yeah.
They had an agenda. Absolutely.
Yep. Well, if you guys want to get a copy,
Also,
anybody,
you know what?
Go ahead, Matthew. I'm listening. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to let people know you've been mentioning that my book is coming out in the fall.
Yes.
And that is actually the case. But you can go to the Ignatius Press website and pre-order. They actually even have a special.
Oh,
There's a web special
good.
on the book. You save a couple of bucks if you pre-order. So
excellent.
Don't hesitate to do that.
Please do go to ignatiuspress.com and get Matthew's book, Confessions of a Traditional Catholic. Also, his Fire and Sword, the 3 CD set. We do have it available, and we do discount it here at the Terry and Jesse Show. I want to also add something to our list here. If you have ever been to the Catholic Resource Center, we have a 110-year-old Catholic church. It's beautiful. We need to put a roof on it. If anybody out there, wants to give a donation to help with our roof project, I'll be honest with you, it's a $60,000 roof. We have $3,705 in the bank for that fund. If you feel like you can give a few dollars, call me at 877-526-2151, and I'd be delighted to take your donation. And it's a 501c3, so you get a tax deduction on it. And you'll know that for the next 40 years, we will keep the rain out of our chapel. Again, my guest here is Matthew Arnold. He's the author of a book coming in the fall called Confessions of a Traditional Catholic. If you want to contact Matthew Arnold, you go to MatthewArnold.org, and you can contact him, especially if you want him to come speak at your event on Our Lady of Good Success or any other topic. He's well-versed. Matthew, your final thoughts about your book.
Well, it was when I came back into full communion with the church,
yes,
one of the first things I did was talk to Scott Hahn. And he said, don't go on a speaking tour, don't write a book, take some time to find yourself and find your place, and get back on solid ground. Mm-hmm. And then it was a few years later that he called, and, some of our friends who are outside of full communion in the church wrote a book, the SSPX wrote a book about how the theology of the Mass had changed, how the church had changed the theology of the Mass, which is in fact not the case.
Right.
And he called me up and said, maybe it's time you went ahead and wrote that book.
Wow.
So it was kind of painful to me, but it's a story, and I want people to know that it is a story of hope, that it's
Amen.
A positive
Amen.
Message, that this, like all things, the church has weathered other storms. We will be able to reconcile this, come out on the other side stronger.
Wow. Matthew Arnold, author of Confessions of a Traditional Catholic. Thanks for taking the time to be with the Terry and Jesse Show, my friend. God love you.
Always an honor, Terry.
Amen, my friend. Again, you're listening to the Terry and Jesse Show. I'm giving away the first CD of Matthew Arnold's Fire and Sword series. And if you want to get his set on the Crusade, Inquisition, and Reformation, I encourage you to get it. You'll learn a lot by calling 877-526-2151. Also, if you want to get the DVD by Matthew Arnold, Fire and Sword, you want to show it to your friends, it's free. You just pay the shipping. 877-526-2151. May God richly bless you and your family.